I became aware of some of the things that Nehemiah is going to be sharing, and we have a special guest with us that he's going to be introduced in a moment. But it was this last year I was not able to go over to Jerusalem. Nehemiah was there for several months, and when he got back, I called him up, and he started to tell me about some of the work that he had been doing. And I was very excited about this and knew that, and I thought right then, I'd love to have him at Passover. And because for everyone to be able to participate in this. And then as we got to talking and he came and visited in December, that is when I realized that there's not going to be room for anyone else. If we just talk about what we did, what we talked about, in private for a few hours that night, there was going to be no way to jam this all in. And so I'm going to now turn it over to Nehemiah, and he's going to take off on, and he's touched on some of this on Shabbat Night Live recently, but to put it all in context, ladies and gentlemen, Nehemiah Gordon.
I am so excited about what we're going to be sharing today. This is something I've been working on for many months. It really all started a number of months back. I was sitting with this gentleman, and he was really rebuking me. He said, "How can you have all these interactions with Michael Rood?" He said, "Michael Rood is leading people astray." And I said, "How is Michael leading people astray? Give me specifics." And it was a bit ironic because this man was a messianic believer. And I said, "You have more in common with Michael than you do with me." So how is it that Michael's leading people astray? And he was looking for different things, and finally he said, "It's John 6:4. Michael tells people that John 6:4 should not be in the Bible. He's removing a verse from the Bible. How dare he do that?" And I listened to what the man had to say, and he wasn't the first one to bring this up. I'd heard this from quite a number of people. And I realized they keep bringing up this one verse. And to me it was a little bit strange because I'm not a Messianic Jew, I'm not a Christian. This is one verse. If somebody came to me and said, "Hey, Deuteronomy 6:4, the Shema, doesn't belong in your Torah," I'd be like, that's a non-starter. But if it was Genesis 10, 26 or something, okay, we could have that conversation. Show me a manuscript where that's missing and we can talk about that, right? So I didn't, I'll be honest, I didn't fully understand, and Micah's going to explain why John 6:4 is so central, but it was difficult for me to fully grasp it. But as he was explaining this to me, I said to him, "You know what, I'm going to look into this, and if I find out there's no evidence to support what Michael is saying, I will sit down with Michael myself and I will correct him and tell him, you cannot be teaching this." I'll say, "Look, Michael, there's no evidence for what you're saying. You can't be teaching this on John 6:4.
Yeah.
So the next morning, I sat down with breakfast with my friend here, John Lorquet, and we were with a third gentleman. And I said to John, I told everybody what had happened and how I'd had this conversation many times. It wasn't the first time. And I said, I explained what happened, and there was another man sitting there at breakfast, and he piped up. He said, "John 6:4, Michael is wrong about John 6:4, and I can demonstrate it." I said, "Okay, now we're making progress. What is the demonstration? What's the proof?" He said, "I asked this manuscript expert, and he told me Michael was wrong." I said, "Well, that's just someone's expert opinion, and they may be right. It really was a big expert." I said, "But I need to look into this myself. I can read manuscripts." And I asked John here, I said, "Would you help me look at John 6:4 and find out, is there evidence to support what Michael's saying?" And I can't prove if Michael's right or wrong, right? That's ultimately something each one of you hearing this needs to decide based on the evidence. But what I could do, and this is what my expertise is to look and see, is there evidence to support his position, or is this just some harebrained theory he just plucked out of the air because he didn't like a certain verse and decided to remove it from the Bible, right? And there's a really big difference between those two things. What I didn't know at the time is my friend John here had already spent 40 hours studying this very question. And he has done hundreds of hours of research. This has been an international effort where I've been involved, John Lorquet's been involved, T-Bone is this godsend who has been sent to us to look through Hebrew and now Greek manuscripts to study things that it would take me a lifetime to do. He does it in 3 days. Can we give a shout out to T-Bone? T-Bone, T-Bone, T-Bone. Yes. We have a gentleman in Greece who's been helping us with this project, Dr. Pavlos Vasiliadis, who we would find something, and I would see this, and I'm like, I don't know, this can't be right. I can't believe what I'm seeing here, and I send it to the Greek expert to verify, and in some instances, he sends it on to other Greek experts. The top people in Greece have been working on this problem. Top paleographers in the world have been helping us with this. We've been talking to the head of the Nestle Allen Project, all kinds of top experts we've been consulting, because I wanted to know, is there evidence to support this or not? And again, I can't, in the end, say you should believe this, agree with what Michael's saying or not. What I can do is present you with the evidence, and you decide for yourself. So we're sitting there at breakfast, and the man says, I can demonstrate it, and I say, challenge accepted. I've spent many endless, sleepless nights ever since working on this project, sometimes 16, 18 hours a day, because I wanted to get an answer. Now, before we get to John 6:4, I hate to do this, because I want to talk about that. But before we get to John 6:4, the gravity of this situation is so great that I want to look at a different verse and talk about that. I want to talk about something in the book of Acts, because we're talking about a really big deal here. We're talking about what many people, over 1 billion people in the world, consider this to be the Word of God, and Michael's coming along and saying this should be removed from their Bible. That is not a small thing. You don't take that lightly. That's a very big deal. And I, as a Jew, I take that very seriously. Again, it's like if it was, Genesis 10:29 or something, that would, every letter there is the Word of God to me. So even if it's some minor verse, the days of so-and-so were so many, okay, but that's still important. So we have to take this very seriously. And so before we get to John 6:4, which we will get to, I want to look at Acts chapter 21, verse 25. And that's actually something that John here brought up with me. And John, tell us the story of how Acts 21:25 came into this conversation.
So I'm having a conversation with a friend of mine, and we have slightly different views on how believers in the Messiah should live. I believe that the Torah is applicable when Yeshua says that we should not live by bread alone, but by every word that God spoke. And my friend has a slightly different view. He believes that believers in the Messiah only need to worry about the 10 Commandments, only the 10 Commandments. And we're having this discussion, and he's very passionate and observes the Sabbath. It's one of the 10 Commandments. And we're discussing some of the things beyond the 10 Commandments, and he says, I need you to show me in the Scriptures a passage that shows that beyond the death, burial, and resurrection of the Messiah, that believers in the Messiah were following the 10 Commandments. So we go to Acts 21, which is a story where Paul comes to James, and James, they're discussing what's been done in the ministry, and James says, here we have all these believers in the Messiah who are zealous for the Torah. But there's this rumor about you, Paul, that you're teaching these things. And I'm going to read you exactly what it says. They've been told about you that you teach all the Jews who are among the Gentiles to forsake Moses, telling them not to circumcise your children or walk according to our customs. And this is, in James's mind, this is a false rumor, because he says, we've got to do something about this. We have to do, and I'm going to read exactly what it says here.
Let me just jump in here. It's a false rumor to James, but to many Christians, it's actually true today. Am I right?
A lot of Christian doctrine comes from false accusations that are levied against Paul, unfortunately.
It's ironic.
James says, what then is to be done? They'll certainly hear that you've come. Do therefore what we tell you. We have 4 men who are under a vow. Take these men and purify yourself along with them and pay their expenses, so they may shave their heads. Thus all will know that there is nothing in what they've been told about you. Mm-hmm. So James' whole purpose here is we've got to show them there's nothing true about what's being said.
In other words, that Paul actually is upholding the Torah, according here to this account, and he's got to demonstrate that to the people by participating in this ritual sacrifice, this ritual in the temple. And this is after according to the Gospels, the death and resurrection of Yeshua, which according to some people today, the Torah was done away with. When he said it is finished, that was the end of the Torah. That's what some people believe. That's John Chrysostom, we're going to see later, says that. Yes.
So at this point, we're in agreement about what's going on. However, the next verse, he's reading from King James Bible, and I'm reading from ESV Bible. And I'm going to read it in the King James Version, which is the version he's reading. I read my version, and he stops me. He says, hold on a second. You've got to stop. Read that again. And I read it again, and then he reads me his version. I'm going to read King James Version here. They say, take them and purify them, and be at charges with them, that they may shave their heads, and all may know those things whereof they were informed concerning thee are nothing, but that thou thyself also walkest orderly, keeping the law. As touching Gentiles which believe, we have written and concluded that they observe no such thing.
Wow. Yeah, guys, I'm going to read that again because that's just so powerful. Did you read the ESV there yet? Or could you read us how it's different?
The ESV reads differently.
Yeah. Okay.
The ESV reads, switch versions here.
Right
have it
there
up here.
on the screen.
Yeah.
You can see that.
But as for the Gentiles who have believed, we have sent a letter with our judgment that they should abstain from what has been sacrificed from idols, and from blood, and what has been strangled, and from sexual immorality.
Wow. Okay, so there's a fundamental difference. I don't know if you guys caught that. We're going to go back over it again. But I want to bring you here first to what he says in Acts 15, because he's alluding back or referring back to something which actually first happened in the book of Acts, where there were people coming to the early, what's called the early church, and saying these Gentiles can't be saved unless they follow these laws, these Pharisee laws, so it seems.
Right, you had Pharisees who became believers.
That's right. And so in Acts 15, let's see, it's verse 20. He said, you should write to them to abstain from the things polluted by idols. In other words, in Acts 21, it's just reiterating what he already had said. Things polluted by idols, and from sexual immorality, and from what has been strangled, and from blood. For from ancient generations, Moshe has had in every city those who proclaim him, for he is read every Sabbath in the synagogues. In other words, the discussion here in the book of Acts, originally in what's called the Jerusalem Council, is we have these people who aren't Jews, and we have to decide, can we even let them into the synagogue? Are they even allowed to step foot in the synagogue to be part of what's called at that time this body of believers? And the Pharisees say, no, not unless they're circumcised and stand before a panel of rabbis. Then if they want to believe in Yeshua, great. Otherwise, they can't even step foot in. And what James decides is, no, there's 4 things we need to get them started. These are the 4 essential things. And then the rest they'll hear every week in the synagogue. And to me, the analogy here is to Abraham. And look, I stole this from Paul. Paul of Tarsus, he says this, right? That Abraham had this covenant with God. And he came into the land when he was 75 years old. But he walked around for decades uncircumcised, walking with the Creator. It wasn't until he was 99 years old that God told him, okay, now it's time to be circumcised. And I think this is what Paul was teaching, and certainly what it seems from James is, look, circumcision for an adult is no small matter. Even today, in Israel, for example, it can only be done in a hospital.
Yeah.
It's a very serious thing. And so the point here is, yes, they can come in the synagogue and they'll hear the Torah, and as they're led, that's what they'll be led to do and keep. But don't keep them out. Don't bar them from joining just because they're uncircumcised. They weren't circumcised. It's easy for me to say get circumcised. It happened when I was 8 days old, right? Don't remember it. Well, I remember a little bit, but anyway. So my mother, we won't talk about that. So let's go back to the book of Acts, chapter 21, verse 25. But and this is the ESV, as for the Gentiles who have believed, we have sent a letter with our judgment that they should abstain from these 4 things. But in the King James Version that John is reading with his friend, there's 8 extra words. In the Greek, it's 6 words. In the English, it's 8 extra words. As touching the Gentiles, meaning concerning the Gentiles which believe, we have written and concluded, James says, that they observe no such thing, referring to the Torah that Paul is demonstrating that he's keeping. That's only for Paul the Jew. according to the King James, it's not for the Gentiles. The only thing they need to keep is these 4 basic things. So the Gentiles are allowed to steal, according to this. The Gentiles are allowed to murder. They just can't drink blood. The Gentiles are allowed to do all kinds of things, just not these 4 things, according to the way that this could be read in the King James. So you're having this conversation, John, with your friend, and he's got his version, and you've got your version, and what do? How do you convince him? You convince him?
I can't say that I did.
Okay.
The first thing that I did is I pulled up some textual commentaries, and immediately they all say the exact same thing, that this is in a certain manuscripts, it's not in others. The general conclusion is that this text does not belong in the scriptures. And the fundamental problem we have, and this is not a unique problem between me and my friend, anybody that's ever sat down at a table with more than 3 or 4 people, you're reading different versions of the Bible. They don't always read exactly the same way. And in this particular instance, I asked him, I said, we've got to be willing to go beyond the text that we have here on our English pages, and we need to do a study here, and we need to determine what the original language of the Bible is. We have a variant here, and we have to get beyond this. The textual commentaries, there's manuscript images that we can go through. We've got a lot of material here we can look at, and there's a very clear conclusion that this text doesn't belong.
Can we look at the versions where this appears? Because you guys have to understand, a lot of times when you're looking at different Bible translations, they'll translate the same thing differently. Here, they're not translating the same thing differently. There's extra words. That's a very different kind of problem. So we actually have here a list that John put together of these 8 words that they should observe no such thing except, right? Those are very key words because that thing there is the Torah, right? This is a direct instruction from James. Don't keep the Torah in the King James. So what are the different versions, John? Tell us that you found.
Well, it does not appear in the Net Bible, the ESV Bible, RSV. Most of the modern Bibles don't have it. The only Bibles that contain it are Bibles that are based on Textus Receptus, like the King James 1611, and those Bibles that came from that similar source.
So tell people, what is this Textus Receptus? Because that sounds very authoritative, right? It's the received text. It's the one that Paul himself or whoever, right? It's certainly that came from the apostles, right?
Not exactly.
Oh, okay.
Okay.
So what is the Textus Receptus?
We don't have the original manuscripts that the apostles wrote. We don't have the original gospels that the gospel authors wrote. We have copies of copies of copies. And there's 5,800 approximately, finding more every day, 5,800 copies of New Testament manuscripts. However, those copies don't always agree with one another. So somebody has to look at these copies where they vary, and decisions have to be made. Are we going to use this version of the text or that version of the text? And this instance here in Acts just happens to be one of those locations where one text reads one way and another text, many other texts, read another way.
Now, you mentioned to me something about this verse that I thought was really interesting, that as far as you know, this is the only direct place in the New Testament where it tells you not to keep the Torah.
Not only that, but this is plain, simple language. Our Father is not going to make us guess what the commandments are. We don't have to interpret an allegory to find out, thou shalt not commit adultery. If he doesn't want us committing adultery, he just says, thou shalt not commit adultery.
Straightforward.
We should not have to go through elaborate interpretations of, Peter says that Paul's hard to understand. We shouldn't have to go through allegories in Paul to determine how we're supposed to behave. Conduct, commandments are done in plain, simple language. And here in the King James Bible, we have plain, simple language indicating that the Gentiles should not observe no such thing.
No such thing.
So this is a huge issue because this has ramifications. There's many textual variants, and most textual variants are on things that have no bearing on your walk or conduct to your faith.
Right.
But in this case, one version tells us that we should not obey the Torah, and without it, this story in Acts 21 is the clearest example in the New Testament of believers after the death, burial, and resurrection of the Messiah who are zealous for the Torah and keeping the Torah.